The rumble of motorcycles echoed through the quiet town like a storm rolling in. A pack of outlaw bikers roared down the narrow streets, their leather jackets glinting in the afternoon sun, patches displaying symbols of defiance and chaos. They weren't just passing through, they owned the road, daring anyone to challenge their dominance. In the center of the group was their leader, a towering figure with a scar running from his temple to his jaw, a badge of violence and rebellion. This wasn't their first time making trouble, and it wouldn't be their last. At the edge of town, a man stepped out of a dusty black SUV. He was calm, almost unnervingly so, as he adjusted the cuffs of his tailored jacket. His presence was magnetic, the kind that turned heads without needing to say a word. He wasn't from here. His sharp, focused eyes hinted at experiences far beyond the confines of this rural town. He moved with the kind of deliberate confidence that came from years of training, his every step measured and precise. There was no mistaking who he was or the weight he carried, a federal agent. This wasn't an ordinary assignment for him. The Bureau had sent him in for a reason. The bikers had been on their radar for months. Trafficking, intimidation, and violence followed wherever they went. Locals were too scared to speak out, their silence bought by fear. But the agent wasn't here to ask nicely. He didn't need anyone's permission to do his job, and he had a reputation for getting results. The two forces met at the town's lone diner, a place where the smell of fried food lingered in the air, and the waitress knew every customer by name. It was supposed to be neutral ground, a spot where lines wouldn't be crossed. The agent entered with an air of casual authority, nodding to the waitress as he sat at the counter. The bikers were already there, sprawled across a corner booth like they owned the place. Their laughter was loud, their presence suffocating. They noticed him right away, but he didn't flinch under their gaze. The leader, sensing an opportunity to assert his dominance, walked over to where the agent was sitting. His boots thudded against the floor, each step heavy with intent. The diner went silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Without warning, he slapped the agent's shoulder, hard, a mocking grin spreading across his face. The slap was more than just a gesture, it was a challenge, a public display meant to humiliate and establish control. The agent didn't react at first. He stayed seated, his hand resting lightly on the counter, his expression unreadable. The bikers laughed, jeering as they egged their leader on. But then the agent slowly turned to face him, his eyes locking onto the bikers with a calm intensity that made the room feel colder. For a moment, it was as if time had stopped, the air charged with unspoken tension. "You've got 3 seconds to walk away," the agent said, his voice low but firm. It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. The bikers erupted in laughter again, not taking him seriously. The leader leaned in closer, his breath reeking of cheap beer. "And what are you gonna do about it?" he sneered. 3 seconds later, they had their answer. The room exploded into chaos. The agent moved like a shadow, quick and deliberate, his training kicking in with precision. Tables overturned, chairs clattered to the floor, and in a flash, the leader was on the ground, gasping for air, his bravado shattered. The bikers, stunned at first, rushed to their leader's aid, but the agent was already a step ahead, disarming one and neutralizing another with calculated efficiency. He wasn't just defending himself, he was sending a message. The fight was over almost as quickly as it had started, but the aftermath left a mark. The bikers scrambled to regroup, their confidence replaced with unease. The agent stood tall, his suit slightly rumpled but his composure intact. He didn't say a word as he walked out of the diner, leaving the bikers to pick up the pieces of their pride. But this was far from over. The agent's departure from the diner was not the end of the encounter, it was the spark. As he stepped back into the fading sunlight, his footsteps steady against the cracked asphalt, the weight of the situation began to settle on the town like an approaching storm. The bikers weren't known for letting things go, especially not when their leader's pride had been so publicly bruised. Inside the diner, whispers filled the room as the locals exchanged nervous glances. They knew what came next wouldn't be pretty. The agent didn't look back. He climbed into his SUV, his mind already turning over the details of his next move. He knew this wasn't just about one altercation, it was about dismantling a network of crime that had been terrorizing the region for far too long. His work required precision, and more importantly, patience. This wasn't the first time he had dealt with a gang like this, but something about these bikers felt different. They were too bold, too organized. There was something bigger at play. As he drove toward his temporary base, a small, unassuming motel on the outskirts of town, his phone buzzed on the dashboard. He answered without hesitation, his tone clipped and professional. The voice on the other end belonged to his handler, a seasoned agent who had been tracking the bikers for years. "You've stirred the hornet's nest," the handler said, half amused, half concerned. "They needed stirring," the agent replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "You're not wrong," the handler admitted. "But these guys don't back down easily. Their leader, he's not just some hothead. He's connected, and those connections run deep. We're talking about more than just a gang here. This is organized crime, and if you push too hard, they'll push back." "I'm counting on it," the agent said, his voice steady. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he wasn't afraid of one either. The key to dismantling any operation was pressure, and he was just getting started. Meanwhile, back at the diner, the bikers were regrouping. Their leader, still fuming from the encounter, paced back and forth in the parking lot, his fists clenched. His pride wasn't the only thing at stake. His authority over the group had been challenged, and in their world, that couldn't go unanswered. The others hung back, waiting for his orders, their loyalty evident but their confidence shaken. "Find out everything about him," the leader growled, his voice low and dangerous. "Who he is, why he's here, and who sent him." "I want answers." One of the bikers, a wiry man with a knack for digging up information, nodded and disappeared into the shadows. The others began discussing their next move, their voices a mix of anger and unease. They were used to being the ones in control, and the thought of someone standing up to them was both infuriating and unsettling. Back at the motel, the agent reviewed his notes. He had spent weeks preparing for this operation, piecing together intel on the bikers' activities. He knew about their smuggling routes, their ties to larger criminal organizations, and their influence over the local authorities. What he didn't know was how deep their network really went. That was the part that worried him, not for himself, but for the people caught in the crossfire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in a deep orange glow, the agent decided to take a walk. He needed to clear his head, to observe the town and its people. There was something about being on the ground, seeing things firsthand, that helped him piece together the puzzle. The streets were quiet, the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, like the town was holding its breath. He passed a small park where a few kids played under the watchful eyes of their parents. Their laughter was a stark contrast to the tension hanging in the air. The agent couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. He knew his presence here would disrupt their lives, even if it was for the greater good. But he also knew that doing nothing wasn't an option. As he continued down the street, he noticed a figure leaning against a lamppost, watching him. It was subtle, almost casual, but the agent's instincts told him it was deliberate. He didn't acknowledge the watcher, instead continuing on his path as if he hadn't noticed. He had been in this game long enough to recognize when he was being tailed. The figure followed at a distance, careful not to get too close. The agent decided to let it play out, curious to see how far they would go. He turned down an alley, a shortcut back to the motel, and waited. Sure enough, the figure appeared moments later, hesitating at the entrance to the alley. "Not your best hiding spot," the agent said, stepping out of the shadows. The figure froze, caught off guard. It was a young man, barely out of his teens, his face a mixture of fear and defiance. "I wasn't following you," the young man stammered, though his body language said otherwise. "Relax," the agent said, his tone calm but firm. "I'm not here to hurt you." What do you want? The young man hesitated, then blurted out, You're the guy from the diner, right? The one who stood up to them. The agent nodded, studying the boy carefully. I need your help, the young man said, his voice barely above a whisper. They took my brother. Said he owed them money, but it's not true. They're lying. The agent's expression hardened. This was exactly the kind of thing he had been afraid of, innocent people being caught in the biker's web of intimidation and control. Tell me everything, he said, motioning for the young man to follow him. Back at the motel, the young man explained the situation in halting sentences, his fear palpable. His brother had been trying to start a small business, a way out of the cycle of poverty that trapped so many in the town. But the bikers had approached him, offering a loan with strings attached. When he refused, they made an example of him, dragging him away in broad daylight while the town looked on, too scared to intervene. The agent listened carefully, his jaw tightening as the story unfolded. This wasn't just about crime, it was about power and fear. The bikers thrived on both, using them to keep the town under their thumb. Where did they take him? The agent asked. I don't know, the young man admitted, his voice breaking. But I think it's somewhere outside town. There's an old warehouse near the highway. People say they use it for their meetings. The agent nodded, filing the information away. He didn't promise the young man anything. Promises were dangerous in his line of work. But he did tell him to stay out of sight and keep his head down. As the young man left, the agent felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't just about taking down a gang, it was about freeing a community from fear. But he also knew that the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous things would become. The bikers weren't the kind to back down, and whatever connections they had would make them even more desperate. He sat back, staring at the map spread out on the table in front of him. The warehouse was just one piece of the puzzle, but it was a start. The bikers thought they owned the town, that no one could challenge them. They were wrong. For now, though, the agent had to play it smart. The bikers were watching him, just as he was watching them. It was a game of cat and mouse, and every move mattered. The town's future hung in the balance, and he was determined not to let it fall into darkness. The night settled over the town like a heavy blanket, the streets deserted as if the air itself carried a warning. The agent sat in his motel room, the soft hum of the heater the only sound breaking the silence. His eyes were fixed on the map spread across the table, every detail of the town etched into his mind. His thoughts kept circling back to the warehouse. It wasn't just a lead, it was a test. If the bikers were operating out of there, it would explain the control they held over the town. But going there meant walking into the lion's den. He checked his gear, every motion precise and deliberate. He wasn't planning for a fight, but he wasn't ruling one out either. His radio crackled to life, breaking his focus. It was his handler again, his voice clipped and urgent. Got some intel, the handler said. Your little stunt at the diner didn't just rattle them, it stirred up some movement. They've been making calls, pulling people in from out of town. They're planning something, and I don't think it's a peace offering. The agent's grip on the radio tightened. This wasn't unexpected, but it complicated things. The bikers were preparing to escalate, and he needed to move before they gained the upper hand. I'm heading to the warehouse, the agent replied. There was a pause on the other end. Be careful. If this goes south, it won't, the agent cut in, his voice steady. I'll handle it. The drive to the warehouse felt longer than it was, the dark highway stretching endlessly before him. The headlights of his SUV cut through the gloom, but his thoughts were sharper. He thought about the young man from earlier, the desperation in his voice. He thought about the townspeople, living in quiet fear. This wasn't just another case, this was personal. The warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the night sky. He parked a safe distance away, the engine going silent as he stepped out into the cold. The air was thick with the scent of oil and rust, the kind of place where secrets were buried. He moved quietly, his steps muffled against the gravel as he approached. From the shadows, he could see the bikers gathered inside, their voices carrying through the still night. The leader stood at the center, his presence commanding as he barked orders. Around him, a group of men worked with practiced efficiency, loading crates into trucks. It wasn't just a gang hideout, it was an operation, the lifeblood of their control over the town. The agent's eyes narrowed as he scanned the scene, his mind racing. There were more of them than he had expected, and the stakes were higher. He couldn't move yet, he needed more information. But then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his breath catch, a young man tied to a chair near the back of the warehouse. It was the boy's brother, bruised but alive. The agent's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about shutting down the operation anymore. It was about saving a life. But he couldn't rush in blindly, that would only get them both killed. He needed a plan, and he needed it fast. Suddenly, a noise behind him shattered the stillness. He spun around, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. It was the young man from earlier, his face pale but determined. "I couldn't just sit back," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. "I need to help." The agent frowned, his mind racing. The boy's presence was a liability, but it was too late to send him away. He motioned for him to stay low, gesturing toward the warehouse. "I need you to stay here," the agent said firmly. "No matter what happens, do not move until I signal." The boy nodded, his fear evident but overshadowed by a desperate determination. The agent turned back toward the warehouse, his focus sharpening. Every muscle in his body was coiled like a spring, ready to act. Inside, the bikers continued their work, unaware of the storm brewing outside. The leader's voice rang out, commanding attention as he laid out their next move. They were gearing up for something big, something that would cement their power over the town. The agent moved closer, his every step calculated. He positioned himself near a side entrance, his breathing steady as he prepared to breach. He knew this was the tipping point, the moment that would decide everything. The tension was unbearable, every second stretching into an eternity. But then, as he was about to act, the unexpected happened. A truck pulled up outside the warehouse, its headlights cutting through the darkness. The bikers inside froze, their attention snapping to the new arrival. The agent watched from the shadows, his mind racing. This wasn't part of their plan, it was something else, something he hadn't anticipated. The truck's door opened, and a man stepped out. He was older, his presence commanding in a way that even the bikers seemed to respect. The leader approached him, his posture tense but deferential. The agent couldn't hear their conversation, but the body language was clear. This wasn't just another gang member, this was someone higher up the chain, someone pulling the strings. The stakes had just been raised, and the agent knew he was running out of time. From his hiding spot, the agent could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to act before it was too late. But he also knew that one wrong move could cost lives, his, the boy's brothers, and maybe even the entire town's. He glanced back toward the young man, who was watching anxiously from his hiding spot. The agent gave a small nod, a silent promise that he would see this through. But as he turned back toward the warehouse, his mind racing with possibilities, he couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was spiraling out of control. The bikers were on edge, their movements sharper and more deliberate. The leader barked more orders, and the men moved faster, their urgency palpable. The agent knew that whatever was happening, it was coming to a head. The warehouse was no longer just a hideout, it was the epicenter of something far bigger, and the agent was standing at the edge of a precipice, ready to dive in. The agent stayed motionless in the shadows, his heart pounding as the tension inside the warehouse thickened. The older man from the truck wasn't just giving orders, he was asserting control. The way the bikers moved around him was different, tense, wary. Even their leader, who had seemed untouchable at the diner, stood stiffly, his jaw clenched as the older man spoke. It was clear that this wasn't a routine check-in, something bigger was happening. The agent adjusted his position slightly, careful not to make a sound. He needed to hear what was being said, but the distance and the muffled voices made it almost impossible. The young man behind him shifted nervously, his breathing shallow. The agent shot him a warning glance, silently urging him to stay still. Any noise now could give them away. Then, a word cut through the air, clear and sharp enough to send a chill down the agent's spine: Federal. The older man said it with a sneer, and the room seemed to freeze. The agent's mind raced. They were talking about him. But how? Had someone tipped them off, or had they pieced it together after the diner? He strained to listen as the older man continued, his voice rising with irritation. This isn't just some drifter causing trouble, the man snapped. He's been watching us for weeks. You let him humiliate you, and now he's circling closer. If we don't handle this tonight, we'll have the feds swarming all over us by morning. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their bravado beginning to crack. The leader stepped forward, his voice defensive. We're ready. He's just one guy. One guy who's already made fools of you, the older man shot back, his tone biting. You don't get it, do you? This isn't just about him. If he's here, that means they know more than they're letting on. We need to shut this down. Now. The agent's jaw tightened as he processed the conversation. The bikers were on edge, but the older man was different. He wasn't panicking, he was calculating, shifting pieces on a chessboard only he could see. This wasn't just a gang leader, this was a strategist, someone who understood the stakes better than anyone else in the room. But then, the older man did something that made the agent's pulse spike. He turned toward the tied-up young man in the corner, a cold smile spreading across his face. We'll start with him, he said, his voice dripping with menace. If this agent is watching, he'll come for the kid. And when he does, we'll be waiting. The agent's blood ran cold. The boy's brother wasn't just a hostage, he was bait. The entire operation was about to pivot, and the agent found himself caught in a deadly game of cat and mouse. He glanced back at the young man hiding with him. The kid's face was pale, his fists clenched in silent panic. The agent motioned for him to stay put, then turned his attention back to the warehouse. He needed to act, but every move was a gamble. The bikers were expecting him now, and the stakes had just been raised. But there was something else gnawing at him, a detail he couldn't ignore. The older man had said we. It wasn't just a reference to the bikers, it was something more. The agent's gut told him there was another layer to this operation, something deeper and more dangerous than a simple gang. And if that was true, taking down the bikers wouldn't be enough. As he prepared to move, a sound behind him shattered his focus, a faint crunch of gravel, barely audible but unmistakable. He spun around, his instincts kicking in, and found himself staring at a figure emerging from the shadows. It wasn't one of the bikers. It was someone else entirely. The figure was dressed in dark clothing, their face partially obscured by a hood. They held up a hand, signaling they weren't a threat, but their sudden appearance only added to the tension. Don't shoot, the figure whispered, their voice low and urgent. I'm here to help. The agent's mind raced. He didn't recognize the person, and their timing was suspicious. But there was something in their demeanor, calm, focused, that made him hesitate. Who are you? He demanded, his voice barely above a whisper. Someone who knows what you're dealing with, the figure replied. You don't have all the pieces yet, but I do. Trust me, if you go in there alone, you're not walking out. The agent's eyes narrowed. Why should I believe you? Because they're not just running drugs and shaking down locals, the figure said, their tone grim. They're moving weapons. Big ones? And the people they're working for won't think twice about burning this whole town to the ground if they think it'll cover their tracks. The words hit the agent like a punch to the gut. Weapons trafficking changed everything. It wasn't just a local operation, it was part of something far bigger, far more dangerous. And if the bikers were tied to it, then this wasn't just about taking down a gang, it was about stopping a potential disaster. The figure stepped closer, their voice dropping even lower. You want to save that kid? You're going to need my help. But we need to move now. The agent hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He didn't have time to question the stranger's motives, not with the clock ticking. The situation was spiraling, the stakes climbing higher with every passing second. The bikers were gearing up for a showdown, the young man's brother was in immediate danger, and now there was a new, deadly layer to the operation. As the agent and the stranger crept toward the warehouse, the tension was almost unbearable. Inside, the bikers were preparing for a fight, their confidence bolstered by their numbers and the leadership of the older man. But they didn't know the agent was coming with an ally or that he was more determined than ever to bring them down. The warehouse loomed larger, its shadow stretching out like a warning. The agent tightened his grip on his weapon, every nerve in his body on edge. This wasn't just a mission anymore, it was a battle for control, for justice, and for survival. And the storm was about to break. The agent and the stranger moved silently toward the warehouse, the tension between them heavy but unspoken. Every step brought them closer to the center of the storm, the air thick with anticipation. The agent's mind raced, calculating the risks and weighing his options. The bikers were on high alert, the older man's cold efficiency evident in the way they moved. They weren't just preparing for an ambush, they were setting a trap, and the agent was walking right into it. The stranger gestured toward a side entrance, their voice barely audible. We'll go in through there. The leader likes to keep the hostages visible, so they're probably near the center of the floor. If we stay low, we can. Before they could finish, a loud crash echoed from inside the warehouse. Both froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. It was followed by shouts, the voices inside suddenly frantic. The agent exchanged a glance with the stranger, his instincts kicking in. Whatever was happening, it wasn't part of the plan, anyone's plan. Inside the warehouse, chaos had erupted. One of the bikers had dropped a crate, its contents spilling across the floor. Weapons, high-grade and unmistakable, gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The older man was furious, his voice cutting through the commotion as he barked orders. But it wasn't just the spilled cargo that had rattled the group, it was the sound of approaching vehicles. Headlights flickered through the windows, and the roar of engines grew louder. The agent realized what was happening a split second before the stranger whispered, "Reinforcements." The bikers weren't alone. Whoever they were working for had arrived, and they weren't here to talk. The agent knew this was his window, the brief moment of distraction he needed to act. He signaled to the stranger, and together they slipped through the side entrance, moving quickly and quietly. Inside, the warehouse was a whirlwind of activity. The bikers scrambled to load the remaining crates, their movements frantic. The older man stood near the hostage, his hand resting on the butt of a pistol. The young man tied to the chair was pale and shaking, but his eyes darted around, alert and searching. He hadn't given up hope yet. The agent moved into position, his heart pounding. He motioned for the stranger to circle around, their silent understanding clear. The plan was simple: neutralize the leader, secure the hostage, and get out before the reinforcements arrived. But plans rarely went as expected. The agent was about to make his move when the older man suddenly turned, his eyes narrowing. "I know you're here," he said, his voice calm but chilling. "You think you're clever, sneaking in like this. But I've been doing this a long time." The room went still, the bikers freezing in place. The agent stayed hidden, his grip tightening on his weapon. The older man smirked, his confidence unshaken. "You're out of time," he continued. "My people are here, and when they come through that door, you'll wish you'd stayed out of this." Before the agent could react, the stranger stepped forward, their voice cutting through the tension. He's not alone. The room erupted into chaos. The bikers lunged toward the stranger, but the agent sprang into action, his movements swift and precise. The next moments were a blur of shouts, the clatter of weapons, the crack of fists meeting flesh. The agent fought with calculated efficiency, each move deliberate as he worked his way toward the hostage. The older man drew his pistol, his eyes locking on the agent. But before he could fire, the stranger tackled him, the two tumbling to the ground in a violent struggle. The agent didn't have time to watch. He reached the young man, his hands working quickly to free him. "You're safe now," the agent said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Stay low and follow me." The young man nodded, his relief palpable. But just as they turned to move, the sound of gunfire split the air. The reinforcements had arrived. The agent's stomach sank as heavily armed figures poured into the warehouse, their faces obscured by masks. These weren't bikers, they were professionals. The stranger was still grappling with the older man, their struggle intensifying. The bikers were caught in the crossfire, their bravado crumbling as the masked figures took control. The agent realized with grim clarity that the reinforcements weren't here to help the bikers, they were here to eliminate loose ends. "Go!" the agent shouted to the young man, pushing him toward the nearest exit. He turned back to the stranger, who had managed to pin the older man to the ground. But as the agent approached, the older man pulled a knife from his boot, his movements quick and desperate. The agent acted on instinct, disarming the older man with a swift kick and pulling him to his feet. "Who sent you?" he demanded, his voice sharp. The older man laughed, blood dripping from his lip. "You have no idea what you've stepped into," he said, his voice full of venom. "This isn't about your little town. This is bigger than you, bigger than all of us." Before the agent could press him further, a shot rang out. The older man's body went limp, his eyes wide with shock as he slumped to the ground. The stranger stood behind him, their guns still raised, their expression unreadable. The agent stared at the stranger, the weight of the moment sinking in. "He had answers," he said, his voice tight with frustration. "He was a dead man anyway," the stranger replied. "You want answers? Get out of here alive first." The masked figures were closing in, their movements methodical as they swept through the warehouse. The agent and the stranger exchanged a glance, their unspoken agreement clear. Together, they fought their way toward the exit, the chaos around them intensifying. As they burst into the cold night air, the agent turned to the stranger. "Who are you really?" The stranger hesitated for a moment before answering. "Let's just say I'm not the only one who's been watching them. But you've kicked a hornet's nest, and it's not over." The agent's eyes narrowed. "Then what's next?" The stranger's expression hardened. "You figure out who's really pulling the strings. And you'd better do it fast because now, they're watching you too." With that, the stranger disappeared into the darkness, leaving the agent and the young man alone under the stars. The agent's mind raced, the weight of the night's events pressing down on him. He had saved the hostage, dismantled the biker's operation, and uncovered a much larger conspiracy. But as he stood there, the cold wind biting at his skin, he knew this was only the beginning. The real fight was still ahead, and the stakes were higher than ever. The agent stood there for a moment, his breath visible in the crisp night air, trying to process everything. The warehouse was now a war zone, and the distant sound of sirens meant law enforcement was finally on its way. He glanced at the young man beside him, the boy's face a mix of exhaustion and disbelief. Despite the chaos, they were alive, and that counted for something. "Come on," the agent said, gently guiding him toward the edge of the lot. They moved quickly but cautiously, keeping to the shadows. The reinforcements inside the warehouse weren't likely to stick around once they heard the sirens, but it was better not to take any chances. As they reached the agent's car, parked a safe distance away, the young man finally spoke, his voice trembling. "What happens now? Are they going to come after us?" The agent opened the car door and paused, turning to look at him. "Not if I can help it," he said. "But this isn't over. What you saw tonight is part of something much bigger, and it's going to take more than one night to stop it." The young man hesitated before climbing into the car, his eyes searching the agent's face for reassurance. He seemed to find enough to calm him, at least for the moment. The agent got into the driver's seat and started the engine, pulling onto the empty road. As they drove, the weight of the night settled over them both. The agent replayed every moment in his mind, trying to piece together the fragments of information he'd gathered. The older man's cryptic words, the stranger's abrupt departure, the reinforcements' ruthless efficiency, it all pointed to a larger network, one that operated far beyond the bikers' local operation. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain: the stakes were higher than he'd imagined. They drove in silence for a while, the faint hum of the engine the only sound. Finally, the agent broke it. "Your brother's safe now. That's what matters. But I need to know, did he ever say anything about the bikers? Anything about what they were involved in?" The young man shook his head, his voice quiet. "No. He kept to himself most of the time. I think he was scared. He didn't trust anyone." The agent nodded, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. Fear had a way of silencing people, of isolating them when they needed help the most. He couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt. If he'd moved faster, dug deeper, maybe the young man's brother wouldn't have been caught up in this in the first place. They reached a safe house on the outskirts of town, a nondescript building that looked like any other. The agent parked and led the young man inside, where a colleague was waiting. The colleague, a trusted ally, took over, providing food and a place for the young man to rest. The agent watched as the boy sank into a chair, his shoulders finally relaxing. For the first time all night, he looked like a kid again. But the agent couldn't rest. There was too much at stake. He stepped outside, the cold air biting at his skin, and pulled out his phone. He needed to make a report, to let his team know what had happened and what they were up against. The call was brief, but the message was clear: this wasn't just a local operation. It was part of a larger network, one that required immediate attention. Over the next few days, the pieces began to fall into place. The bikers' operation had been a front, a way to move illegal weapons through quiet towns without drawing attention. The older man had been the linchpin, the one holding everything together. With him gone, the remaining bikers scattered, their loyalty evaporating in the face of potential prison time. Some were caught, others disappeared, but the network was far from dismantled. The stranger's warning lingered in the agent's mind. Whoever was pulling the strings hadn't just lost a pawn, they'd lost a key player, and they wouldn't take that lightly. The agent knew he'd made himself a target, but he also knew he couldn't walk away now. The fight was far from over. One evening, as he reviewed the case files, a message arrived on his secure line. It was encrypted, but the signature was unmistakable. It was from the stranger. "Keep looking. They're closer than you think." The words sent a chill down the agent's spine. The stranger had disappeared that night, but they hadn't vanished completely. They were still watching, still involved. Whether they were an ally or a threat remained unclear, but their warning couldn't be ignored. In the weeks that followed, the agent worked tirelessly, chasing leads and unraveling the network piece by piece. He uncovered connections to other towns, other operations, all tied to a shadowy organization that operated with precision and ruthlessness. It wasn't just about weapons, it was about power, control, and the ability to operate beyond the reach of law enforcement. The young man and his brother were relocated, given new identities to ensure their safety. The agent visited them once before they left, wanting to make sure they understood the gravity of the situation. The young man's brother had recovered physically, but the emotional scars ran deep. Still, there was a flicker of hope in his eyes, a determination to move forward. "Thank you," the young man said as they said their goodbyes. "For everything." The agent nodded, his expression serious. Take care of each other. And if anything feels off, anything at all, you call me." No hesitation. They promised they would, and the agent watched as they disappeared into their new life. It wasn't a perfect ending, but it was a start. As the days turned into weeks, the agent continued his work, driven by the knowledge that the fight was far from over. He knew the risks, the sacrifices that lay ahead. But he also knew why he was doing it, because sometimes, standing up to the darkness was the only way to keep it from consuming everything. One night, as he sat alone in his office, a package arrived. There was no return address, but the contents were unmistakable: a file, thick with documents and photographs, detailing the organization he'd been chasing. At the bottom was a note, written in the same cryptic style as the stranger's earlier messages. "This is just the beginning. Stay ready." The agent leaned back in his chair, the weight of the message settling over him. The fight wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. Because in the end, it wasn't about winning or losing, it was about doing what was right, no matter the cost. And as the night stretched on, the agent prepared for the battles ahead, knowing that every step brought him closer to the truth.